Welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and what a delight and an honor today to have a very special guest. James Rosebush is with us today. He's the Deputy Assistant to President Ronald Reagan and the Chief of Staff to the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, and the first person, by the way, to hold both of those positions. Also a senior advisor there at the White House, but he's the author of a book entitled True Reagan, What Made Ronald Reagan Great and Why It Matters. And there's a picture of there on the screen. Let me encourage you to get a copy of this book. I just started reading it a couple of days ago, and I'm fascinated by it. Always been fascinated by the Reagans, and I think this is a must-read, so pick it up at the bookstores. And by the way, speaking of bookstores, this is a first. We're interviewing James from a storeroom at Barnes & Noble. Hi, James. How are you?
Hey, good morning, Perry.
That's pretty good. Wow. Hey, thank you for your book. I've been particularly fascinated with the Reagans for a lot of reasons, but I was working at Channel 3, KCRA in Sacramento, as a young reporter when President Reagan at the time was Governor Reagan, so we got to meet him on many occasions when he came into the studio, and so quite the person to say the least.
Oh, absolutely. It was the greatest honor of my life to serve the Reagans. You know, we just started a 22-city book tour, and the outpouring of almost desperate interest in Ronald Reagan and the desire to learn more about him has been so heartening to us as we travel around the country. I think in part, this is happening because of the desperate situation our country and the world are in for looking for leadership and leaders of great character. And that's what my book is all about. So this book tour has really taken on the feeling of a real mission. And in the middle of this presidential campaign, I feel as if I'm upholding the Ronald Reagan standard of leadership right in the middle of the political campaign.
Oh, boy, if there's ever a time we need a Ronald Reagan, it's now. By the way, James, how did you connect? How did you get involved with being in the White House and being where you were with him?
That's a good question. I'm often asked that, but sometimes people say, how did you get into the White House? They have a little emphasis on that. So I was active in the business and philanthropic community, and in the late 1970s became acquainted with a team of advisors who worked for the Reagans and actually ran the Reagan campaign. So after the president was elected, I got a call and I was invited to come work in the Reagan administration. And my first answer was, no, I don't think I want to do that because I was very happy in my career and my position. Well, I slept on it. 24 hours later, I called back and I said, is that offer still good? And then the rest is history. I never anticipated really that I would be brought into such close proximity to an American president and first lady.
Well, it's an amazing story. What is your goal with this book? I mean, it's interesting you'd come out with it now, and as you're saying, you're getting great reviews as you travel the country, but what's the goal of your book?
The goal is to tell the part of Ronald Reagan's story that he could not tell himself. So many people say Ronald Reagan made us strong, he did great things, but I don't really understand what motivated him, what was on the inside. Ronald Reagan kept his character, his faith, his values and belief systems very much wrapped up, and that was a part of his genius as a leader. He would have been marginalized in Hollywood and in American politics if he had discussed some of the things that were really going on inside. He kept it very buttoned up. So this is the first book that really opens up the mysterious part of Reagan, that quiet part, and the part that's so vital to understand because we're beginning to see with such a leadership crisis in the world, what are the key ingredients in great leadership? And is there one key ingredient that really makes a leader great? And we can see in this book that it is character. And this is the book that talks about Ronald Reagan's character. Many books talk about what Ronald Reagan did, his accomplishments, and those are important, and we need more of them, as a matter of fact. But this is a book where I describe what Reagan told me. This is not my conjecture, but what Reagan told me about the roots of his faith and his belief systems, really going back to his mother, who was a substitute preacher in her church, and how he learned his values from the Bible, how he was actually a Sunday school teacher, and how he basically spent 25% of his life in and around the church. But he didn't talk about it. It was an inner walk that he had. And this is a book that begins to not only explain that, but creates this link between what he was able to do and his value systems. And the reason I have as a part of the title, why it matters, is I hope this book will prove its value over decades and generations, so that they can come back and say, well, Reagan was a great leader. He's in the top 5 of all U.S. presidents because of his character and his values.
There seemed to be a deep resolve within his soul that I would assume is a result of his faith, that he seemed to be unwavering in his purpose of what he decided to do. I mean, he had this, I'm trying to find the words here, James, he had this inner, I guess it was just God on the inside. I don't know how else to explain it. Can you help me with it?
Well, that's a good way to say it, and there's a good way I can help you with that, because he helped me with it. So one day we received a letter from a constituency asking, does President Reagan have any favorite hymns? So I held this letter for a few days, and when I was up in the family quarters, I was talking to the president in their bedroom one day, and he had read his Bible to me. He again talked about the roots of his faith, but I said, Mr. President, we've been asked, do you have any favorite hymns? And he said, oh, yes. And I said, well, what are they? And he said, well, let me sing a couple of them to you. And the first, and his favorite, had a refrain that goes like this: and he'll walk with me, and he'll talk with me, and he'll tell me I am his own. And instantly I recognized that this was really the emblematic of Reagan's character. He didn't talk about it, but he had a quiet walk with God and such a dependence on God that was really the basis of his optimism, which so many people are acquainted with and are encouraged by, because he gave people hope based on his optimism. And, you know, he always said America's best days are still ahead. I believe now that he could say that, and he felt that because of his faith and because of his walk with God.
Did he feel that he was divinely appointed to become president?
He would shrink from that kind of characterization. He never discussed his legacy, but I believe we can see this in how he conducted himself as a grand strategist on trying to rid the world of the evil of totalitarianism, of Soviet-style communism, and any walls that separated a man from his God. You know, the 6 most iconic words of the last century, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, are contained, and were almost not said, by the way, but are contained in a great speech celebrating the 750th birthday of that ancient city, Berlin. Some of the words later in that speech include the phrase that he was opposed to any walls anywhere that separated a man from his God. So it was as if he saw his role in history, but in a humble way, in more of a servant attitude. So Ronald Reagan, every time he walked in the Oval Office, he felt the awe of it. He felt the respect for it. And he left the White House the same man who entered. He didn't need accolade. He didn't need praise. He just knew that he was doing his job, and I believe he was listening to divine providence.
He was an incredible orator, and I've read on many occasions where he obviously wrote most of his speeches. If not, he heavily edited what was given to him to sound like him. But he had a unique way of giving a speech, and I'm not even sure if it was a speech. You kind of got the feeling you were having a conversation with a friend. But boy, he was known as the great communicator. Where do you think that came from?
You know, Ronald Reagan said, I wasn't a great communicator. I just communicated great ideas. And if you look at his speeches, which you're absolutely right, he wrote, and certainly before he went in the White House, he wrote all of his speeches longhand on yellow legal pads. And once he came into the White House and he had a team of brilliant writers, and it was somewhat easy to write for Reagan because you always knew where he stood. You knew the roots of his belief system, and if anyone really understood Reagan, it was the speechwriters. And yet, he was heavily involved in giving them direction and editing them. In fact, I have a couple of his speeches where in his own hand you can see the edits, the crossing out, and so forth, which, going back to that speech in Berlin, of course, those words were crossed out many times by advisors from the State Department, Defense Department, the National Security Council, and even his own chief of staff. And when he alighted from his motorcade in Berlin that day, he said the boys at the State Department aren't going to like this. He put the words back in. But the reason his speeches glisten, and I like how you characterize that, he drew you up close. And if you look at his last speech from the Oval Office, when he said goodbye to the American people, and he said, you know, I've often referred to America as a shining city on a hill, but I don't think I've ever described what I saw when I was discussing this shining city on a hill. And then he goes to talk about a city with open doors to all who would enter and benefit from our free way of life and from our constitutional rights. So it was as if, you're right, he did draw us up close, as if, as I say, you were talking to your father or your grandfather. It was an intimate way of talking, and yet it was also a way of talking with grandeur, because he referred to people. 96% of his speeches, he referred to the Bible or to God. He often referred to the great patriots. One of his favorite sayings was from the patriot Thomas Paine: we have it within ourselves to begin the world over again. And he gave people the feeling that they did have that ability to begin the world over again.
Let me take a quick break here, James. We'll come back. We'll move over to the First Lady as well, because you were Chief of Staff. Let me just say to our viewers and listeners, this is what the book looks like. It's called True Reagan. There's a picture of it there on the screen, put out by Center Street Press. I'm sure you can check it out at Barnes & Noble, where he is right there, or look for it at Amazon as well. And we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.
I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at theDove.us.
Welcome back, and what an honor to have with us today James Rosebush. He's the author of a must-read book, and get a copy of it. I just started reading it a couple of days ago. It's called True Reagan: What Made Ronald Reagan Great and Why It Matters. And he's dealing with a part of the Reagan legacy, or the Reagan story, that goes into the soul of the man. And let me encourage you to get a copy of it. It's put out by, let's see here, Center Street Press, and I'm sure that you can get it at Barnes & Noble and also check it out at Amazon as well. James, so many things here. You the first person to hold really two jobs in the White House, Deputy Assistant to the President, then you went on as Chief of Staff to the First Lady, and as we're all saddened by her passing just recently. But this couple was unusual, to say the least. They were public and yet private, and very much in love. Help us to understand that.
Well, they were a team, and one would fill in for the other. One had strengths in one area, strengths in the other area. They really were a perfect team. And I always say, in particular, the American taxpayer got a great deal out of Nancy Reagan, because she worked tirelessly, not only for her own causes, and especially focused on ending youthful drug abuse around the world, and also anything that her husband was focused on. She wanted to be supportive of him as well. And of course, I saw him light up every time. I remember, for example, she was the First Lady to ever hold a bilateral meeting with the Pope on a significant issue. We went to Rome, had a few days of meetings there, and then joined the President in Germany for a summit meeting. And I remember her running up the staircase to meet him at the top, and they're held in a strong embrace there. I have a picture of that in my book. And I think that shows the kind of sort of constant, they were in each other's thoughts constantly. And of course, she had to go through the terrifying experience of the president being the target of an assassin's bullet. And that whole experience, I think, added a level of anxiety in her life as well. You know, that day she was at a luncheon outside the White House in Washington, and she had a premonition that she needed to get back to the White House early. And she excused herself, went back to the White House, and when the Secret Service said that there had been a shooting, she said she wanted, but they said to her, but you stay right here, hold in place. She said, either you pull up the car or I'm walking to the hospital, which would have been about 1.5 miles away. So she was a fierce defender. You know, it was often said that if Ronald Reagan owned a shoe store, she'd be right in there fitting shoes. So they were a great team, and they worked very well together. And that's why my position, holding a job both for the president and the first lady at the same time, was very effective in our administration, because she was interested in what the president was doing, long-range scheduling, all the things that have to do with what the president was doing as well as her. So we really meshed. The gears really worked well together.
That was obvious, and it was very noticeable, but yet they were very private, weren't they?
Oh, yes. You know, there was a friend of mine who was a journalist, and she decided she got an interview with the president, scheduled an interview with the president in the Oval Office, and she asked her editor, well, what could I really ask him that might open him up, expose a little more of what was going on inside, as you call his soul? And so she said, Mr. President, everyone knows that you like to chop wood and clear brush up at your ranch. In fact, you do it all the time whenever you can get there. But what do you think about when you're chopping wood and when you're clearing brush? And without skipping a beat, he said to her, oh, Susan, what I think about is the wood. So he famously was not willing to talk about what was going on inside. He kept it all to himself. And I think to a certain degree, Nancy Reagan did as well.
Did she share the deep, abiding faith that he had?
I think he was the one in the family that had the deepest faith, by virtue of the fact, as I explained a little bit earlier, Perry, about his upbringing. She didn't have that kind of upbringing. So Reagan had this support and education and practice, really, in the church. And he went to a religious college, of course. His great mentor was his minister. He dated the minister's daughter. He expected to marry her. He even thought of going on to theological school. So he was really steeped in this through age 23, when he went away from home to get his first broadcast job as a reporter for the Cubs. And, you know, it's interesting, he called radio at that time, which is what he was reporting, the medium he was reporting from, the theater of the mind, because he was only receiving news of the plays by telegraph. He wasn't actually seeing them. So he had to create the kind of excitement and tension that would thrill the audience, and indeed it did. He got very high marks for this, because he was recreating it out of the news he was getting on the wire. Eventually, then, he did go to the baseball stadiums and report from those, but it was a part of his creative ability to make his audience see what he saw. And of course, he was, in the case of those baseball games, he was only seeing them mentally. And this, I think, carried through in his ability to communicate his concepts and his beliefs and what he thought about the bulwarks of our American system, and how it was created not just for the benefit of Americans, but for people around the world everywhere.
Two last questions, James. Number one, what got him interested in politics? I mean, he went from broadcasting to Hollywood, and I know that he was head of the Screen Actors Guild, but what got him into deep politics?
Oh, well, that was the natural. So as early as 1954, you see him speaking at William Woods College, and he's calling America more of an idea than a place. This is the same college where Winston Churchill coined the term Iron Curtain and Cold War. And from that point, you see his interest in things that were public issues. I think being active in Hollywood as a union leader and head of the Screen Actors Guild, he had to deal with issues that, particularly the whole communist witch hunt at that time, where he really had to sort out and defend his fellow actors. These were things that were very concerning to him, and that was the beginning of where he could see the evil of communism and its attempt to control not only countries but individual lives as well. So I think that was a part of his motivation as well. And then I think here he was, as a person who held many jobs, he wasn't just a screen actor, but he was also, in addition to being a union leader, he was a corporate spokesman riding the rails for General Electric. And that also gave him an ability to develop the critical planks of his platform. He tested all of his ideas at the factory gate, got this kind of critical response and reaction from GE factory workers that he really needed. So it was a building process. And then it was natural for him. He was approached by friends in California to run as governor. And by then, you know, the rest is history. When he introduced Barry Goldwater at the 1964 Republican Convention, in this historic speech, which is called A Time for Choosing or Rendezvous with Destiny, when he says, it's not about the right or the left. It's about whether we go up or down and whether we protect the future for our children and grandchildren.
Well, that was a classic speech. All right, finally, James, as you look back, I mean, here we are in one of the most strange election cycles in the history of the United States. We got a lot of problems. We're coming out of an administration that really has changed this country in so many ways. As you look back, you were in the White House during one of the most remarkable administrations in American history. I can't imagine what you feel.
I feel responsible to go out, as we're doing, to all these cities across America to help share what I learned, the benefits of what I saw there. You know, years ago, when I was in the White House, I was standing in the Blue Room with a reporter overlooking the Washington Monument, and she said to me, now, you know, you have to publish all this. You have to tell this to the American people and for history. And I shrunk back from the thought that I had the responsibility to do that. Today, I know that responsibility. I've carried these things in my heart. Now I need to share them more broadly so that everyone can see this critical link between character, faith, beliefs, and great leadership.
A lot of people try to tag themselves to Ronald Reagan. Republicans and Democrats, they try to live in the shadow of him. And I get a little frustrated with that because he was unique unto himself, and I don't know if that's fair. But we haven't seen a leader like that since him, and obviously we need one now. Does that bother you that people would try to come alongside and say, I'm just like him?
I understand it, Barry, because he was a massive winner of elections. So anyone on either side of the aisle is going to want to say, attach themselves and ride up, shine by the borrowed light of Ronald Reagan. But the problem is, he never explained why he was successful. And this is what this book does. And this is why it's so critical and why Rudy Giuliani said every political candidate needs to read this book. If more candidates did, perhaps they would inculcate some of these qualities of Reagan's character into their own and not just try to hitch their wagon to his star politically.
Well, thank you, James, for your work, and thank you for feeling the responsibility to get the story out. Let me say to our viewers and listeners, get a copy of this book. I just started reading it. I'm fascinated by it. It's called True Reagan, What Made Ronald Reagan Great and Why It Matters by James Rosebush. It's put out by Center Street Press. I'm sure you can get it at Barnes & Noble, online at Amazon.com. One of the things I learned early on from Ronald Reagan was he never mentioned his opponent by name. He would say the other side, the other party, the other part of the aisle, but very rarely did he ever criticize by using the name of the opponent. And today, boy, it's just the opposite. We're slinging everything out there.
You're right.
You know, and so incredible man of character.
Ronald Reagan didn't see anyone as an opponent. He was a guileless person, and he adhered to that 11th commandment, as he said, never speak ill of your Republican competitors. So he never spoke ill of anyone. He was a highly unique person and someone that we need more of.
Question about it. Thank you, James. God bless you, my friend. Thanks for your work. Let's connect again, okay?
I'd love it.
Okay, nice seeing you. We'll be right back.